Welcome back to Three Men and a Mystery. I'm one of the three men, John Lorden.
This is Mike Morford.
And I'm Gray Hughes.
In our last episode, we learned a lot about interrogations and avoiding false admissions or false confessions, thanks to expert Carl Stinselli. On April 3rd, Coley McCraney was in court for a preliminary hearing, and we learned a lot more about the case being built against him. The defense also highlighted some issues with his interrogation. So what they said was that, first of all, the entire interview was recorded, which I think is always a good thing, and I'm thankful that that happened. He was handcuffed for 8 hours. They said that he was given bathroom breaks. They're saying that for the whole interview process from start to finish, he was in there for 25 hours. The defense even called out the fact that he apparently slept on the floor, and that was corrected by the person they were questioning, saying, well, he slept on a mat that was on the floor. They questioned him after he asked for an attorney 8 times, according to his defense lawyer. They say that it was actually once, and there was a kind of a slick little answer they gave about, well, he was actually asking if there was a lawyer in the room, and we were telling him no, or if there was a lawyer in the building, and we were telling him no. So I really don't know. I don't know why that came up that way, and I don't know if that's really a good defense. I think when someone asks for an attorney, you're pretty much, you understand what they're asking for. But it was noted that he wasn't eating. And at one point, Chief Walker, who we know knows Coley back from high school days, came in to try to get him to eat. He did get him to eat a couple of French fries. And investigator Michael Bryan stated, "We did not mistreat, abuse, or threaten McCraney in any way during apprehension." So I want to put it to you guys real quick. Do you think, considering what we've learned about his interview or interrogation, was it a good or a bad interrogation to you? And keep in mind everything that we heard from Carl Stinselli last week. What do you think, Gray?
Well, it sounds like it was a bad interview, but we're also hearing it from the defense perspective. So we don't really, I'd like to see the actual videotape of what went on to see if what we're hearing from the defense attorney is accurate.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I think, at least for the three of us, I can speak for all of us, when I would watch every minute of that 25 hours just to see exactly how this thing went down. What do you think, Morph?
Well, if he said anything about an attorney, in my mind, that should have been the end of it right there. They should have stopped and let him get an attorney. And if he asked 8 times or mentioned 8 times whether or not there was an attorney, that's really concerning.
Yeah, and I'm curious if there's any information from the interview that they're going to try to use, and if that's going to come into play. You know, hey, he was asking for an attorney back here, and you guys essentially exhausted him and wore him down, and then, he started making these statements. But ultimately, they didn't get a confession, which, they were in there for 25 hours. Obviously, they were working as hard as they could to get a confession. Today, we're going to go over all the new details that we learned during the preliminary hearing and discuss Coley McCraney with criminal behaviorist Sarah Cailean. We'd now like to welcome Sarah Cailean to the show. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. We were fortunate enough to, at least Morph and I, spend a little time with Sarah at the Cold Case Conference. Had some really good conversations, and I'm really excited to bring her on the show and get her insight about all this new information we have about Coley.
Hey, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience?
Sure. So I was a police officer and a detective and sex crimes investigator for about 10 years, all told. I originally started out in federal law enforcement with the Department of the Interior, and then ultimately found myself with a municipal agency in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. I spent the bulk of my time on patrol there in central Ohio. I ultimately left patrol to pursue a more academic avenue and to spend the bulk of my time researching serial killers and serial sexual predators. I also taught at both the federal and state academy level for some time. So all told, I've got about 20 years of experience or training or education or a combination thereof.
Yeah, so we also heard that you have a television project airing soon.
We do. I was brought on originally just as a consultant for a woman who was writing a book about a series of unsolved homicides and disappearances in Northeast Oklahoma. You guys may actually even be familiar with the Bible Freeman case, the two teenage girls who went missing after the one girl's parents were shot and killed and the home was set on fire. So I was approached to come on as a consultant for that about 3 years ago and to work with Jax Miller, the woman who was writing the book, on the case. Ultimately, her team with her agency kind of felt that it had a documentary angle to it. And so we were picked up by Stephen David Entertainment and then ultimately Turner Networks for CNN and HLN to do this 4-part documentary series on the Bible Freeman case down there in Oklahoma. So that we wrapped that up this winter. We wrapped up filming after 3 years, and that will be airing on HLN starting Sunday, June 2nd.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I forgot.
Yeah, no, really looking forward to seeing that and seeing your work on that as well. And I'm really excited that we have you here today because obviously you've got some really good background and knowledge, very specific to the type of crime that we're talking about that happened to JB and Tracie here. So exactly who is Coley McCraney? Well, we've done some digging and we've got some information. He is a 1992 graduate of Carroll High School. He was on the track team and served as vice president of the school library club. Coley actually wound up joining the Air Force in 1993 and served until 1997. He was sued in a paternity case in September of 1998 and was ordered to submit his DNA by a judge on July 30th, 1999. That's literally the day before JB and Tracie's crime, according to court documents obtained by the Dothan Eagle. He failed to appear for the DNA test and failed to appear in response to a second DNA test ordered months later. McCraney overall has a clean criminal record. He's currently married with 6 children, 8 grandchildren, to the same woman that he was dating back in 1999 when the murders occurred. He has stayed living in the local area for the past 19 years, and he has been working as a truck driver. In 2013, he helped create Spirit and Truth Life Ministries, and it's reported that he's an ordained bishop. However, the address for the ministry is a home, and the current residents don't know anything about the church, at least when they were interviewed by television reporters that showed up there. So, Sarah, I've sent you several files on Coley, including the forensic sciences report, the arrest report, search warrant, and a bunch of other info. Did anything in particular from all that information I sent you stand out?
Well, yeah, absolutely. The first thing I want to say is almost kind of a caveat. I mean, at this point, we know a lot less than there is to be known. Does that make sense? So anything that we say really is speculation, and it's based on the information that we have at hand.
Yeah.
And so for any of these items, there could be explanations, or there could be, alternative scenarios that would sort of change the direction. And I just want to make sure we say that because I don't want to play fast and loose with anything without saying that this, a lot of it is going to be speculation just based on the pieces we're trying to put together with what has been provided to the public. And with that, I would just hope that as we talk for a little bit here, that the best thing that I can do for you guys is to give you really more questions so that, as this goes on and as this goes to trial and as your season continues and stuff, that you can say, this is one of the 2 possibilities that we looked at for this or something like that. So
right.
With that, the thing that jumped out at me, at least everything that I have read about this case since we first started talking about it a few months ago, and even as recently as 5 years ago, the police department, as best as I can understand it, was on the record as publicly stating that they did not feel that this was a sexually based homicide.
Right.
That there was no sexual assault. There was discussion about the possibility of semen on JB's pants, but they sort of they kind of went to great lengths to say we do not feel that it was a sexual in nature crime. So when we get the lab report, which is dated March 22nd, which is interesting because he was actually arrested, it looks like, on the 18th. So the lab report is dated the 22nd. I assume that means that at some point the lab gave them a verbal confirmation that this guy was a match. But what's interesting is that the arrest warrant and the lab report both specifically state that it was the result of a vaginal swab, and which means that they suspected rape of JB. And when they reference the medical examiner's report, the pathologist's report in the arrest warrant from this year, it specifically states that the pathologist at the time of the murders believed that a rape had taken place. So, of course, we know that agencies have 1,000,001 reasons to withhold information from the public, and I get that, and I rarely question that.
Right.
But it's strange to me, like I've kind of been spinning for the last 24 hours in reading this, because I do not understand why they would go to such great lengths to say it was not a sexual case when they clearly, from the very beginning, from the day after the murders, believed that it was.
Well, if they did, and I think that's one of the things that's being questioned. I know I spoke to a reporter in the area, and he thought it was interesting that the forensic report was even released publicly the way that it was. It was basically added to the court records as part of the discovery. But they've also referred to the autopsy reports, and those are not available publicly, at least through those legal files where I've been getting most of this information. So,
right, but I'm looking right now at the probable cause for the arrest, and block 6 of the probable cause, it specifically states during the autopsy, the forensic pathologist indicated she had been raped. So that means that in 1999, this is not something. I mean, we know that with the advancements in DNA, just in the last year or two, never mind the last 20 years, that a lot of things are being resubmitted to labs. I'm working on a case in Alabama right now where we're going through that. We're like, what can we resubmit? Because this 25-year-old case, obviously they weren't going to be able to even pull DNA off of things that they can now. So I would understand that if they said at this point they resubmitted, all the body swabs in order to see if there was anything. But at least the language in the probable cause warrant says that the pathologist in 1999 believed that JB had been raped.
All right,
but other than the swab, was there anything else that indicated rape? Because I don't. A lot of times you hear people say that there was a rape because there's other physical, like bruising and so forth. Correct. But if there's no bruising, how can you call that a rape? Right.
So that's one of the things that I have in my notes here as well, is that we really just don't know the probable cause, because I don't have the ME's report or the autopsy report, so I can't see if there's anything that indicates other stuff. Like you said, bruising or tearing of some kind that would indicate forcible rape.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, this is one of those things that I'm just sort of like spinning in circles, and I keep coming up with new questions rather than any answers.
There's a very interesting clip. This is actually from a video posted by Ricky Stokes, who's a little bit of a local kind of independent reporter. He also works, I think, as a bails bondsman, but he posted back on July 29th of 2014 a video with Chief Spivey talking specifically about this case. And here's what Chief Spivey had to say at that time.
It's just an absolute mystery. Number one, as to why someone would do this. We're still unsure of a motive. Robbery does not appear to be a motive. Rape was not a motive. So, absent of the reason why someone done this, right now the only motive is the murder of these 2 young girls.
So, Sarah, let me ask you, is it normal? You've said it's one thing for police to withhold information in certain cases. It's a whole different thing, I would think, to have them lying publicly. Is that what we're looking at here?
Right. That's what to me is so strange about the whole thing. I don't think I've ever seen that. I mean, it may just be that is sort of, an unsophisticated way of trying to withhold the information.
Right.
But I think, unfortunately, it really does a disservice to the community's faith in the agency doing the investigation when it turns out there's just a blatant falsehood. And, again, if they had not been able to get any information, if the pathologist had not specifically stated rape in 1999, I would be willing to overlook that and just say they just didn't know what a rape necessarily looked like and they got it wrong. But it does seem like, they took this information from the pathologist and then went forward to the public and said, the exact opposite, not just didn't include everything, but actually lied. And so I can't quite wrap my head around what the rationale would be for the agency, like what they gain from it.
Right.
Sometimes police actually disagree with the pathologist, like in the Jonathan Cruz case, for example, and they go out and say the opposite of what the autopsy might say.
Yeah. No, that's true. There's so much information missing. Like, it may well say in the pathologist's original report that there was bruising, that there were these other indicators, and they're just pulling out this one line. I would tend to trust the medical professional when it came to something like that. Actually, I mean, even as a former officer, there are certainly things that I don't know that a doctor, which is what a pathologist is going to have insight that I don't have. So I if the ME said unequivocally that this was sexual assault, I certainly can't see myself in a position as a spokesperson for a police department to go out and just dispute it, and to not even say why.
Yeah. Especially when you're talking about a case where you're wondering what the motive is. So if you have a professional that's saying that, then, fill in the blank. I don't understand why.
And he is the chief. He certainly could have said, the pathologist feels that there may have been sexual assault. We are uncertain about that,
Right.
And I don't know. I feel like obviously the initial thought when McCraney was first arrested and everybody said, well, the only thing that they have is this DNA on her pants. And so he's just going to say that it was consensual, that they knew each other. Well, now he could still say the same thing, though it appears during questioning in those 25 hours that he claims not to have known anything about the girls or the crime.
Right.
So his defense is going to be hard pressed to say, oh, that's right, they were actually dating and this was consensual.
Yeah. Morph, I just want to let you get in on this. You have any insight or thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm with Sarah. It's a little bit puzzling because the narrative has been all along since 1999, no sign of sex attack, no rape, and then to suddenly see those rape charges is just sort of mind-boggling. It's got me scratching my head.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed too, and this I may be getting a little into the weeds, but in the complaint, which is a different piece of paper than the probable cause warrant. In the complaint, it sort of lists the series of events as Tracie was shot, and then JB was raped, and then shot. But the warrant sort of tells the timeline as JB was sexually assaulted, and then both girls were put in the trunk and then shot. And those are two totally different crimes. I mean, the outcome is the same. Is that unfortunately you have two young girls brutally murdered, but as far as making a case in this going forward, I don't know if that was, again, just a mistake that was made in the way that something was hastily drawn up. I mean, in a lot of other respects, everything seems to be very well, like, I's dotted and T's crossed. So it seems strange to me that they actually list the order of events as two wildly different crime scenes.
Right.
I mean, how are you controlling two essentially adults. I mean, legally they're juveniles, but they're full-grown women. This is not, like the Delphi case with these two young girls, where it might be easier for somebody to control two of them. It seems strange that you could keep one at bay while you sexually assaulted the other and then killed them both. And like we said, unless you have more than one person, is one thing there, or the order of events in the complaint is correct, where he simply controlled the two of them with a weapon, killed one, and then sexually assaulted and killed the other.
Yeah, I think you have to consider it that way if you are trying to keep it down to one person. Yeah, because right. I don't see two girls at 17 years old just kind of rolling with it. If they had a moment to look at each other and knew the seriousness of the situation, I think someone would have acted out in some way, and it doesn't look like
right.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if they weren't successful in it does seem that there would have been more indication. And again, two 17-year-old girls, if a 25-year-old guy is pointing a gun at them, they're going to do what they, It's not the movies. People do generally what they're told when someone's pointing a gun at them, and that's understandable. So it's not that it's impossible, but it does seem that the component of the sexual assault would have made it possible for the other one to try and get away. And that's, again, that could just be a detail that they listed incorrectly. That whoever wrote one didn't realize that the other one kind of was framed a little bit differently. But it matters, and it's going to matter to the defense.
Yeah.
And to me, this brings up the crime scene photo that we've seen of JB in the trunk with her pants completely up where they would normally be, with her belt fully buckled as if she just got dressed and went out. And I wonder if there was any kind of rape or sexual assault. Would her pants and belt be fully done as if she just simply got dressed and went on about her business?
Have you seen that, Sarah, in any previous cases?
I have not. I thought you meant I haven't seen that photo. Yeah,
no. I mean the act. I mean, have you seen that someone has gone as far as sexually assaulting someone, killing them, but then fully redressing them?
Yeah. I mean, you can see almost anything. I would still speculate that he had her get dressed herself. You know what I mean? That he didn't kill her until after she was already dressed, and he moved them someplace or moved her someplace. Because you do see that where after a sexual assault, somebody will give instructions, essentially. If it happens in a home, sometimes they'll make the women, go shower or, stuff like that. So I could see it more to the point of, he has killed Tracie, he has sexually assaulted JB, and he's got her at gunpoint telling her, get dressed. And she's just doing what she's told to try and survive.
Yeah.
And she may have even been alive where the car was found, right? Like, let's say Tracie was already put into the trunk.
Right.
Then they drove there. Because here's the thing is, I think after you've killed somebody, the other surviving person would be much more likely to comply. Yes. You wouldn't have the guts anymore, because now you know that this person will follow through and will kill. So it could have been that Tracie was still alive and then forced to get in the trunk, and at the last minute was shot right there.
Right. And again, looking at the complaint in item 11, it says at some point...
JB, excuse me.
And he said at some point he then raped Miss Beasley and then forced Miss Beasley and Hawlett in the trunk of the car and subsequently shot them both in the head. So they do, and I was under the impression that they did not feel they had been shot in the vehicle. Am I wrong about that? Didn't originally they feel like they were shot someplace and then put in the vehicle because there were no shell casings in the trunk?
No, they're pretty sure that they were shot in the trunk, but at a different location. They're very strong that they think it did not happen at that particular location. We've kind of theorized why they would conclude that, like if there's, if the bullet penetrated the trunk and wasn't found outside of the vehicle or something along those lines.
Was it a 9mm or a 22?
9mm.
It was a 9mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would think a 9 would go through. Through probably. So the other question then that all of that begs is, the type of offender, if we are talking about one person and we are talking about either order of events, but more than likely the death of Miss Hawlett and then the assault and death of Miss Beasley, you're definitely, I think, looking at somebody who, in terms of their criminal careers, is fairly immature, because it's not, if you're going to plan this sort of an event, you're not going to plan it with multiple people. You're not going to plan it out in the open like that. And then it all kind of feels very like there's a really high impulsivity factor to it.
Yeah.
Because it is not ideal circumstances. Like you have no control over the environment. You might, even if he did drag them out into the woods somewhere at gunpoint, like, with all the mud they've talked about on their clothes and stuff, anything can happen. Anybody could come along. And it sort of feels like the whole thing is very disorganized and sort of a spur of the moment decision. Unless your goal is to sexually assault both of them, which is, again, a totally specific type of offender, it seems like it had to have been just right in that moment, like this is an opportunity and I'm going to sexually assault one of these girls, and then they just sort of end up dead as a side effect of the whole thing.
Now, based on the information that we've talked about here with Coley's backstory and the info that you're seeing from the documents that I sent you, does he fit the profile of someone that would be capable of doing this?
I don't think that we know enough to see. The only thing, there were a couple of things in what little we've seen about him that jumped out at me as being possibly, a hint of problematic behavior. One of which was, in a number of interviews, his wife, I think in an attempt to show the public how religious he is, how he's a man of God, she talks about how he does sort of spot quizzes for their whole family about like Bible verses and
right.
Theology learning and stuff. And that might be nothing. It also had a little bit of a feeling of sort of a dominant personality to me. This kind of like testing everybody around you all the time to see if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that's not a great character trait. And then the other thing was that he had a lot of overlapping addresses. Like, even though he's basically been in this same area for a long time, he had this kind of slew of P.O. boxes all over the Deep South that overlapped with each other. And it's not even, it's one thing if it's like, oh, I put my mom's address down where I used to live on this license, and then on this apartment application, I put down my old, it's not like that. It's like taking out P.O. boxes takes effort and money and planning. So why do you have all these overlapping P.O. boxes? So if indeed it was him, I think we're going to find that there's a whole background to this guy that nobody, maybe even his wife, knows about. Because on the surface, no, he doesn't look like somebody. I mean, you would think if he had poor impulse control and a compulsion to commit sexual offenses, there would have at least been some indicators. Even if there weren't arrests for this type of behavior, there probably would have been indicators. Now, we don't know why he left the military. It was 4 years, so maybe he just did his 4-year sign up and he was done. Or it could be that there were problematic incidents in the military and he was either discharged or asked not to reenlist.
We are going to get a little more insight into that as we go through some of the comments that came out of the trial information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Is there anything in the military background that would point to that? Because sometimes that stuff is kept very tightly sealed.
Yeah.
And that would be the time period that, like, right out of high school and into his early 20s would have been the time period that we would expect to see a sexual offender starting to really express problematic behavior.
I think that's the perfect prompt for us to go ahead and push through into that info. Let's start reviewing it with you.
Awesome.
Yeah, and this is new information for Sarah. I've kind of kept this information from her because I wanted her natural responses and reactions to this. But before we jump into that, just one last question about if you committed a crime of this nature in a town of that size. I mean, you're talking relatively small town size, smaller community. Is it normal that someone that did something like this would stay in that area? Because it seems like he's lived there the whole time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if he thinks he's gotten away with it, when Valentine was so quickly named as the main person, and even up until McCraney, I mean, everything that I saw when you first told me about this case and I started looking at it, everybody that was still saying, oh, it might have been Valentine, it might have been Valentine.
Yeah.
So he may have just thought he was in the clear. A lot of sexual predators, if indeed that's what we're looking at, absolutely fancy themselves as smarter than everybody else in the room. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not.
Right.
So, and he also, how do you explain to your then girlfriend, ultimately wife, we can't be here?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Let me ask one question. Do you think that it could have been a stressor, the part about him having to give his DNA for the paternity test? Because it was just the day before.
It's really interesting that you would say that. I'm looking at my own notes that I was making last night. I literally wrote that down. So good call, Greg. That the trigger, that the stressor for him may well have been this fear of being busted with this paternity thing, because that's going to put his relationship on the line. If it's not obviously his girlfriend's child, it's going to put his professional stuff, possibly if he had been going back to the military or anything, these kinds of things. So I'm scanning my notes right now, but we definitely are on the same wavelength there. That was my feeling as well.
All right, let's go ahead and jump into the information that we learned from the preliminary hearing.
Yes,
so
please.
They ruled that there would be no cameras allowed there. So reporters were sitting in the stands and primarily using Twitter to publicize what was being discussed. I want to give a quick thank you to WTBY News 4 and WDHN for their coverage of this event. So we're going to be reading to you guys the tweets that were going on to get some more insight about what's going on with this case. So the judge initially said that prosecution does not have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt today. The only purpose of this hearing is to determine if there is sufficient evidence to take the case to a grand jury. They moved the hearing to the largest courtroom, and it was completely packed with spectators. The reporters saying they haven't seen this many people at a preliminary hearing in a long time. Of course, we haven't seen a case like this in a long time. Coley McCraney's wife and Tracie Hawlett's mom are only a few feet apart in the courtroom. Each is staring ahead and have not looked directly at each other. Lieutenant Michael Bryan of Ozark Police Department is now on the stand. He's the commander of the Investigations Division. He mentions that gunpowder was embedded in the girl's hands. He then says the deadly shots came from one of 3 brands of a 9mm firearm. Coley McCraney's name never came up during the investigation. Bryan says that he actually had never heard of Coley McCraney before his arrest. McCraney's power was connected at the home he was living at the time on June 12th, 1998. And this home is on a street that is now called Patterson Drive. The residential complex is still there. McCraney's old residence was less than half a mile from Big Little Store, where the girls were last seen. And this is.
So, I'm sorry, I'm just going to jump in. The power was disconnected at the address that he had given, meaning, I guess what they're saying is that he wasn't really living where he said he was living.
Exactly. What happened was when they brought him in, at least from the initial paperwork we're seeing, the address that he gave, I think, is actually his family's.
3 miles away, right?
Yeah, it's his family's address on Coleman. So they actually had to go to records from the power companies and some of the other utility companies, and they found a different address. And that address is strikingly close to where the car was dropped off. It's strikingly close to the gas station, and it's almost right in the middle of where the girls were heading in terms of the turn that they would have been taking to get back to the highway. So
I knew those addresses were problematic. All right.
Yeah. And the one that he actually was at wasn't on that list. The background check that I sent you did not have the address that he was actually at there. So, the water department records show the water at McCraney's home was cut off on August 19th, 1999. So you're talking within 3 weeks of the actual crime, all of a sudden the water's being shut off to the home that he was living at. The power was turned off only 15 days after the murder occurred. McCraney told police he lived in a different location with his mother on Coleman Drive in Ozark during the murder. So now we've got some new steps that have happened around the crime. What do you think, Sarah?
Well, yeah. I mean, he's obfuscating deliberately. When did he give them that information? Just when they first took him in January, or when they first brought him in for questioning this past January?
They investigated to find the information about his utilities, and that's the time frame that they were putting out.
But I guess what I'm saying is, was he ever looked at in 1999?
No.
Or was all this information about, oh, I lived here, I lived there, all these choices that he made, those were only like since he came on the radar in January of this year?
Yeah, no. According to this, from what Lieutenant Brian was saying, he was not investigated at the time.
Okay. Right. So that means at that point, he had almost 20 years to kind of generate an excuse for himself or, kind of to cover his tracks. And what he came up with was, I didn't live anywhere near this. I mean, 3 miles is quite a distance, really.
Yeah.
Whereas a half a mile and right smack in the middle of everything is obviously not. And, it's interesting, too, because if you look at the way geoprofiling is done, a lot of times the spot where something happened is this sort of like it's equidistant to these really significant places in a person's day-to-day life.
Yeah.
And also, it can change if there are multiple sexual assaults, then you'll see that each of them is kind of equidistant either from the home or where they work or something like that. That's not an accident. I think he hoped nobody would notice that the power had been turned off there, that his family didn't really live there.
You raise an interesting point, though. If he had 20 years to generate an excuse, and they were so public the whole time about having the DNA of this person, why wouldn't he have come up with an excuse that included how his DNA wound up on her?
I don't know. It might be that because they had said for so long that there was no sexual assault involved, that he actually believed that. And so he kind of felt like he was in the clear. He may also not have a really firm understanding of how DNA works. I mean, I'm looking at like the lab report, and you would think everybody has known now for, actually just about 20 plus years. I mean, like if you look at OJ and stuff, that was when the public was first really introduced to it. But, like I'm looking at the lab report, and it says that of the vaginal swab, the possible the potential contributors are Coley McCraney and JBH Beasley. And she goes on to say one of 14 million Caucasian individuals and one of 48.6 African-American individuals. So it really, there's just, the odds are astronomical that it could be anybody's but his.
Right.
And he just may not have understood that. And he also, he was kind of cornered. He didn't want to take that DNA test in January. And, it kind of sounded like he resisted it. And then his wife said, oh, just take it. What have you got to lose? And he just kind of was like, well, I'm just going to, roll the dice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a question for you regarding that whole process, Sarah. Mm-hmm. I talked to Paul Holes, and when I told him how that went down, he was a little bit surprised because he said in all these cases that are getting solved, mm-hmm. where they're catching these guys with forensic genealogy, when they get onto somebody, they don't give them the opportunity to submit. They find their DNA, right. They verify it's them, and then they take them down without warning. Is it unusual to you, in your opinion, that they would go up to him and say, hey, do you mind if we take your DNA in this case?
This is a new world to all of us, except for Paul Holes, and so I would certainly defer to him on that. When I left patrol and when I left the Bureau, this was not even dreamt of. But we certainly haven't seen anything like that yet. It seems like they do want to get the best possible opportunity. Now, it may also have been that for whatever reason, they did not think he was any kind of a risk. It may also be, I mean, it may be that they were pretty positive it was him, that they had already gotten, the verbal stuff from the lab and believed it was him anyway. And so they just thought, we'll just ask. And it may have even been inexperience. It may be that this is a brand new, burgeoning area of law enforcement, and this is a small department that just may not have known that they should have done it a different way.
The story from Chief Walker is that he actually sent the DNA over to Parabon. Parabon replied, but they didn't have a pinpointed match. They basically replied with a list of, surnames and, your suspect is someone that is related to these families. Mm-hmm. And Walker says he looked at that list and he knew McCraney because he went to high school with this guy. And at that point, they were just asking Coley for his sample to help their efforts to drill the results down further. That kind of his expectation at that time wasn't that Coley was the actual suspect right off the bat.
I don't know if I believe that.
Yeah, I don't either. This is just a story that
right.
That was
and it's,
through the LA.
It seems like
that's the story they told McCraney.
It seems like a conflict of interest to me that I don't know if there's a protocol when someone that knows the person is the one going there to go after the DNA.
No, that's not unusual. I mean, DNA is a whole different thing, but it's really just an extension of the fact that small town law enforcement, if people are going to know, but you can't, a chief couldn't recuse himself from involvement in a case where everybody went to high school if he's serving as a chief in the town that he grew up in. And in fact, 80% of law enforcement personnel in this country are classified as working at a small department, which means 50 or fewer officers. So, McCraney's lived there his whole life. This chief has lived there his whole life. It's not that big a deal. And in fact, it may be that he, it may be that his story is, we just wanted to do a match, when in reality, he thought this guy was problematic in high school. There were things about him I never, liked. Now, a judge would be a whole different thing. A judge couldn't rule on the case. He would need to recuse himself if he went to high school with him or something like that. But law enforcement, a lot of times people are policing the communities they grew up in. It's just the way it is.
So initially we heard there was no criminal background on Coley. And now we get some new information continuing with the tweets from the preliminary hearing. McCraney had aggravated assault, battery of child less than 16 years of age, unlawful detention, possession of unlawful weapon in 2004 while in Air Force. And I don't know why they're saying 2004 because the other info I've reviewed says he wasn't in the Air Force at that time.
Yeah,
but we're now hearing that. Yeah, we're now hearing that there's a background in terms of his military records.
Yep.
Brian also says that the military records show that McCraney owned a high-point 9mm pistol, same as the weapon believed to be used to kill the girls, and that the weapon was owned illegally.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say, I told you so, but
I was gonna say you nailed it.
That's good. That makes me feel better because I was afraid coming into this. I'm like, this is so much new information. I'm going to look like a complete idiot. So I'm kind of glad I pulled one out. That military record was definitely feeling like a black hole where there was room for a lot of possibilities, and it certainly bolsters the case that this was pattern behavior.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is, the kind of the prosecution side that's being presented now. Defense will question them at some point, and we'll get their questions about this information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it's, yeah, I mean, that's essentially, assault. And it's interesting. I'd be really curious as far as the assault on somebody under 16, if it was one of his own kids. But it seems unlikely because did he have his kids already when he was in the Air Force, or do we?
Well, that's what's weird about the time frame, because the initial time frame, I think he would have had some children, but if this is occurring in 2004, then the odds obviously are much better that more of his kids were around.
Yeah, I wonder if he went back into the Air Force, which is entirely possible. Although it seems like I think we would have heard about that by now.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm really not sure about that date discrepancy, but I'm hoping we'll learn more.
Say it again. The thing about there was something about unlawfully holding someone.
Yeah, McCraney had aggravated assault, battery of child less than 16 years of age, unlawful detention, and possession of unlawful weapon in 2004 while in the Air Force.
Yeah, I wonder if the reason that the weapon was illegal was that there was some sort of if the battery of a child under 16 would have also been, if it was his, then that also is classified as domestic violence, and you're technically not supposed to be able to get a gun if you've been convicted of domestic violence. Or it could be, we had a case, the department that I spent most of my time on patrol with, where a guy was mad that his 16-year-old son had stayed out past his curfew, and so when the son's friend was dropping him off, he beat up the friend and dragged the friend into the house to then continue beating him. And so it was actually a kidnapping and aggravated assault and unlawful detention and all that stuff. And it wasn't even his own kid, so it wasn't domestic violence, but it was, So you can, there's a lot of possibilities there. But it does. I would bet you almost anything that the reason he wasn't allowed to have a weapon was some sort of a domestic complaint at some point.
And that would have held up even if this was something that was only processed within the military?
I think that is fuzzy. My understanding of it is that technically, yes, that's supposed to be the case. The military, most of the branches of the military are not always good about releasing that information when they're supposed to in order to let these prohibitions come through. But if you were charged with domestic violence as part of your time in the military, that should still technically apply.
I've got a question related to that. Let me ask you this. Are all these events that you just read off, are those derived from the same incident?
Right.
Yeah, so because that would matter regarding the gun issue that you just mentioned, because it seems like there was an assault and then unlawful detention probably resulted from that, right? Like he took the girl and assaulted her, and then maybe they found but there was a weapon. Maybe the weapon and the two charges are separate. But do you know, John, if those are the same?
No. He dragged somebody somewhere at gunpoint. Exactly what we suspect happened with the girls, in which case that would be. And it may be that the ones that they're listing that came out in these tweets or whatever from the court are just the ones that have been offered up by the prosecution as this is why, like this sort of character assessment of this is why we believe this guy is connected to this pattern of behavior. And maybe he's got a whole history of stuff that's not even being included in there because they don't know or don't consider it part of this case. Right. Now you would think if there were sexual assaults that they probably would have mentioned those, but
yeah. Well, and also if he had this whole pattern and this history of being this type of person, what's your take on the odds that he would stop being that type of person after committing the crime with JB and Tracie?
Oh, none. I mean, there's, all of us are hardwired in a certain way, and we're all kind of programmed to go about our lives in a certain way. And if you are either hardwired or have been raised in such a way as, for violence to be the language that you speak, or a combination of the two, it's pretty rare that it ever changes. And so if he was committing minor offenses in the military in his late teens and early 20s, and then this incident happened. I mean, this incident, if this was McCraney with these two girls, I tend to think that he didn't set out thinking he was going to kill them. I would speculate that he probably thought, I'm going to have some fun with them. And then it either got out of hand or one of the girls started to run, and that's when he shot her. And then, he sexually assaulted and then killed the other. It doesn't feel like this was a very well thought out
premeditation.
Yeah, exactly. Although, I want to ask real quickly, you said something, there was gunpowder embedded in the hands?
Yeah.
But they were not shot in the hand. Like, there was no wounds.
Well, they might have been defensive. Like, I would imagine the girls are putting their hands up to their face.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. So, like, if they did that, then the gunshot didn't go through the hand. It was just nearby.
Right. Yeah. No, the wounds are specifically to both of their heads. No wounds mentioned on anywhere else except for a scratch on Tracie's arm. But that's it.
Was it the front of the head, the back, the side?
It was different. For one of the girls, it was a temple shot for Tracie. And for JB, it was actually kind of through her cheek.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, the temple, that sort of feels like execution. And it could be that she put her hands up to kind of cover her ears, sort of, I mean, like she's being put down on her knees and just, as a reaction to protect her face or her head, or if he even said, cover your ears or something, that you could end up with gunpowder. He had to been fairly close for very strong gunpowder residue on their hands.
Yeah. Well, the assumption is that they're in the trunk when this actually happens.
Right.
So, yep.
Although, again, we have two different narratives on whether they happened, boom, boom, or whether there's, these minutes with the sexual assault in between the two.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel a lot stronger about him after all of this than I did, 24 hours ago. Yeah. Well, let's continue with the information. See if you still feel that way by the time we get through the defense's point of view. But so can I say something real quick? I was listening to you guys when you were talking about the attorney thing, and at the very beginning when supposedly he invoked his right to an attorney 8 times, the way that I was trained was that it doesn't matter how they say it, what the sentence structure is, if they barely speak a word of English, if the word lawyer or attorney comes out of their mouth, you stop everything. All bets are off. That's how I was trained. And I believe I was well trained. I went through just an outstanding academy system. But when I heard you say that, I just, the whole thing about like, oh, well, he was asking if there was an attorney in the room. No, He said the word, you have to shut up, because, the problem is now you're going to have his attorneys saying that anything that was taken from that interview is fruits of the poisonous tree, and, the exclusionary rule attaches and it's no good. Now, in this case, it doesn't sound like he said much of value.
That's a really important point. Yeah.
But you don't know that going into an interview, what somebody's going to say.
Right.
But one thing he supposedly said in that interview was that he didn't know them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So if they throw that out, now he can come back and say, yeah, I did know them.
Yeah.
And,
right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of where I was headed to. But
All right. So the next tweet, DNA evidence was analyzed and profile was created for the CODIS database. CODIS is only for those who were arrested for certain crimes and not military members. Lieutenant Bryan then continues saying the forensic report showed stains on Beasley's sweater and underwear. Items are still in possession of Ozark PD. The sweater is more of a tank top than a sweater. After the arrest, McCraney denied knowing Ms. Hawlett and Ms. Beasley. So this is the big question, right? I mean, if he knew them and this was a consensual act, why is he telling the police that he didn't know them? And essentially, this is kind of his best defense at this point.
Right.
So I don't know why. I don't know why it's going that way. The only thing that keeps going through my mind is he's with the same woman that he was with at that time. So if he was worried about some aspect of that harming his relationship with his wife, maybe he was going to deny it. But would you really deny it all the way through an interrogation process that's been going on for 25 hours?
Well, I mean, as your guest last week talked about, you'd be amazed what people will or won't say in their own best interest.
Does it matter what time in the interview the lawyers mentioned? So let's say he said, I didn't even know them, and then 30 minutes later said,
yes,
I'd like to speak with the attorney. So all of that can be used up until that, right?
Exactly. The exclusionary rule attaches after, once the person says they want to talk to an attorney. Up until then, as long as it's, as long as they believe that they're speaking freely and they know that they have a right to invoke, which is why you Mirandize, then you're in the clear. They can use that. So yeah, if he didn't invoke or say the word attorney until, 2 hours in, everything in those first 2 hours is still good. I mean, a defense attorney may try and say, oh, the whole thing was obviously under duress because he was thinking about attorney, but it's probably not going to fly. I'm also really interested to see if, now that they have him in CODIS, if other stuff's going to come up. If there are going to be other victims, either living or deceased, where we're going to find that his DNA was attached to the case.
I do think his DNA was in CODIS previously. It wasn't attached to his name, but I believe that they entered the DNA into CODIS way back. So,
I see.
Yeah, so if there was other crimes, they probably would have been found by now.
Okay, so the DNA, the unknown offender DNA from 1999 was entered into CODIS.
Right.
Okay.
I believe so. It's it's kind of hard to tell through the Twitter chain, but I
don't know. I definitely would want to explore that a little bit because I do find it unlikely that this was a completely isolated event.
Right. Well, that's as far as we're going to go with this episode, but be sure to come back next week. We've got a lot more planned, a lot more that we're going to get into with Sarah Cailean. I want to give a very big thank you to Sarah for joining us here today and remind everyone out there to watch Hell in the Heartland on HLN June 2nd, 2019 at 9 p.m.
And we'll be doing our first live stream to discuss the case on Wednesday, May 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time or 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And be sure to look up the conversation on Gray Hughes Investigates on YouTube, and be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, because if you don't hit the notification bell, you might not ever get notified. But even then, YouTube still might not do it, so just make sure to check the channel on those dates and times. We will also do another live stream on July 31st, the 20-year anniversary of this senseless tragedy.
You can also find video versions of our podcasts at my YouTube channel, Lord and Arts. And since we're intentionally trying to raise exposure using each of our platforms, remember that you can find all the information and links that you need for any specific episode together all in one place at www.threemenandamystery.com. And that's with the number 3. You'll also find contact info there for local law enforcement and both legal teams. So if you have information to help shine the light of truth on this case, please, please, please send that in.
And if you have any feedback, corrections, or new details, they can be sent to us via email at threemenandamystery.com, or you can reach out to us on Twitter at 3menandamystery, or find us on Facebook. And if you're looking for another true crime podcast to listen to while you're waiting for the next episode of 3 Men and a Mystery, consider listening to Frozen Truth. Here's a sample.
Hello, 3 Men and a Mystery listeners. My name is Scott Fuller, and I'd like to invite you to join me in another mystery. I've spent the last 6 months and more investigating the disappearance of a television news anchor from a small city in Iowa. Her name was Jody Huizentrout, and in Season 3 of my podcast, Frozen Truth, I've been trying to find out what happened to her.
She had to enter the parking lot about 4:30, maybe 4:45. As she was going to the car, she was attacked from behind. A scream was heard. Apparently, she was struck and dragged unconscious or dead to the assailant's waiting vehicle. Now, from there on in, it's pretty much conjecture.
It was on the news every day. It was on every channel, and there was always an article in the paper.
She also told me that Jody was buried. She told me that the person did not mean to kill her, that they just were, it was an accident. We don't know if he has anything to do with Jody. What we know is a very violent criminal was living 2 blocks from Jody when she disappeared.
It's almost like he caught at what he had said previously about going out and kill somebody else. And then he changes the subject. I'm not a monster by any means. The media played me up. Strange, Scott. There's some strange stuff this guy says.
The way you guys digging up all this stuff, I mean, I'm quite sure if you know, police departments, FBI, all those guys, they probably did the same thing and came up with the same thing.
We've had some new information come in, and we're still running into people, believe it or not, today that haven't talked to us yet.
My search has taken me to Mason City, Iowa. I've spoken with almost 100 people, including the police and the people who knew Jody best and those who saw her last. Join me in my search for the Frozen Truth. You can subscribe to the Frozen Truth podcast wherever you're listening to Three Men and a Mystery, and the whole series is also available on our website, frozentruthpodcast.com. It's time to find Jodi.
Three Men and a Mystery is produced by John Lorden, Mike Morford, and Gray Hughes.
And if you will, just take a moment to please rate and review us on the podcasting platform that you found us on, and help us grow by telling your friends and family about us.
We hope you'll join us on the next episode where we continue with Sarah Cailean. Thank you so much once again to Sarah for her time. I'm John Lorden.
This is Morph.
And this is Gray Hughes.
And we are Three Men and a Mystery.